January 4th, 2010, Los Angeles, West Hollywood, 11 in the morning. In an elite neighborhood hidden behind high gates, an unnatural silence reigns. The maid opens the door to the guest house on Mulholland Drive. The air inside is stuffy and cold. The thermostat is turned off. There is no light. Water supply is shut off for non-payment. In the center of the room, among piles of garbage, dirty dishes, and scattered clothes, lies the body of a young woman. Her name is Casey Johnson. She is 30 years old. She has been dead for several days. The police report will record frightening details: rats in the backyard pool, chaos resembling a den rather than the home of an heiress to one of the richest dynasties in the history of the United States. The paradox of this scene causes nausea in anyone familiar with the deceased surname. Casey Johnson is the great-great-granddaughter of Robert Wood Johnson I, founder of the Johnson & Johnson Corporation, the very man who in the 19th century taught the world sterility, hygiene, and health care. The logo of this company is a symbol of safety known in every home on the planet: baby powder, Band-Aids, sterile bandages. But the heiress of this empire dies in filth, in complete solitude. The cause of death is diabetic ketoacidosis, a complication of type 1 diabetes that occurs with a critical lack of insulin. The irony of fate here borders on the cruelty of an ancient tragedy. The Johnson & Johnson Corporation is one of the world's largest producers of medical equipment for diabetics. The girl whose surname is on billions of medicine packages died because she did not use the medicine available to her. Her body, found in a cold house, became the final point in a story that began long before her birth. This is not just the death of a socialite. This is a crime scene where the killer is not a specific person, but a colossal fortune that corrodes human souls. To understand how one of America's most influential families came to this moment of complete moral and physical decay, we need to rewind the tape. We need to transport ourselves from the dirty bungalow in Hollywood to a place that was supposed to become a symbol of greatness, but became a monument to human greed. We are heading to Princeton, New Jersey, to the estate that local residents called the American Versailles, Jasna Polana. It was right here, 30 years before Casey's death, that the drama unfolded which broke the backbone of this family. This is the story of how an old dying patriarch, his young Polish maid, and 4 rejected children entered the most expensive and dirtiest battle for inheritance in the history of American jurisprudence. At stake was not just a fortune of $500 million. At stake was control over reality itself. In 1971, a woman entered this closed world of big money who had nothing but ambitions and a master's degree in arts. Barbara Piasecka, Basia. She arrived in America with $100 in her pocket and did not know a word of English. A few years later, she would become the owner of the most expensive private house in the country and manage a staff exceeding the population of a small village. But behind the facade of marble and gold hid an architecture of hatred. Jasna Polana, built as a temple of love, turned into a golden cage for one and an impregnable fortress for others. When the 87-year-old J. Seward Johnson was dying in this house, his own children were forced to break through to him through security cordons, and his wife, the former maid, was already rewriting the will that would shock the entire world. Casey Johnson's death in 2010 is merely the echo of that explosion that occurred in the 1980s. This is not a story about business. This is a story about the curse that the Johnson family bought with their own money. There are no heroes in this story. There are only victims, executioners, and witnesses. And there is the house that saw everything. We begin the investigation. Welcome to Jasna Polana. To understand the nature of the catastrophe that occurred in 2010, it is necessary to return to the origins. We cannot consider the tragedy of the heirs without understanding what exactly they inherited. And they inherited not just money. They received at their disposal an ideology built on blood, sterility, and the harshest competition. 1886, New Brunswick, New Jersey. Three brothers, Robert, James, and Edward Meade Johnson, make a decision that will change world medicine. Inspired by the lectures of Sir Joseph Lister on the importance of antisepsis, they create a company with a simple but revolutionary goal: to save lives by destroying microbes. At that time, surgery was a death sentence. Doctors operated in dirty frock coats. Instruments were not sterilized. Mortality from post-operative infections reached 80%. The Johnson brothers offered the market something unheard of: ready-made sterile bandages. This moment is important. From the very beginning, the Johnson family's philosophy was built on the idea of purity. They sold sterility. They sold safety. But inside the family itself, there was no sterility. There, bacteria of envy and domination flourished. By the middle of the 20th century, the company had turned into a global monster. But the real drama unfolded in the second generation. The script of this dynasty began to be managed by a man whom, in the family and business, they simply called the General. Robert Wood Johnson II, the founder's son, a man with a bulldog jaw and the character of a dictator. He headed the company in 1932. It was the General who turned the family business into an international empire. He served in Washington during World War II, receiving the rank of Brigadier General, and transferred Army discipline to the corporation. The General wrote the famous Credo of Johnson & Johnson, a document carved in stone at the headquarters. It stated, "Our first responsibility is to doctors, nurses, and patients." Shareholders were mentioned last. This was brilliant PR. But in his personal life, the General professed the principle of social Darwinism. He despised weakness, he hated laziness, and most of all, he despised his younger brother. J. Seward Johnson I, the main hero of our tragedy. Born in 1895, Seward was the complete opposite of the General. If Robert was a warrior and builder, then Seward was a hedonist and fugitive. In childhood, he suffered from dyslexia, which, at the beginning of the 20th century, was considered a sign of mental retardation. His father and older brother openly called him a loser. This psychological scar defined his entire life. Seward did not want to manage the company. He wanted to be left alone. While the General conquered markets from Europe to Asia, Seward spent his time and gigantic dividends on collecting works of art, breeding purebred cows, and, most importantly, oceanography. He was a director of the company, but it was a sinecure. At board of directors meetings, he often remained silent or was absent. His true passion was the sea. Water became his refuge. On his yacht, he was the captain. No one could call him the stupid younger brother. But there was one nuance that made Seward dangerous: money. In 1944, fearing taxes and wanting to maintain control over the shares, The family created a complex system of trust funds. These trusts were legal fortresses. They guaranteed that Seward and his children would receive astronomical sums of money regardless of their talents, hard work, or moral character. By the end of the 1960s, Seward Johnson's fortune was estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars. In today's terms, billions. He lived the life of an old-school American aristocrat. He had a proper wife, Esther Underwood, a member of high society. They had 4 children, Mary Leah, Elaine, Diana, and James Seward, Jr. Outwardly, it was an ideal picture: Christmas cards, estates in New Jersey and Florida, closed clubs. But behind closed doors, an icy emptiness reigned. Seward was an emotional invalid. He feared his own children, did not know what to talk to them about, and preferred to buy them off with checks. The children, in turn, grew up in the shadow of 2 giants: the tyrannical Uncle General, who considered them spoiled trust fund kids, and the absent father, who was always busy with his yachts and phobias. And Seward had many phobias. He was panic-stricken with fear of kidnapping. After the Lindbergh baby story in the 1930s, fear for his safety became an obsession. He carried a weapon with him. His homes were equipped with alarms ahead of their time. He built bunkers in case of nuclear war. This is an important detail for understanding his psychology. Seward Johnson perceived the world as a hostile environment. His wealth was not a tool of creation, but a wall with which he walled himself off from reality. By 1968, Seward was 73 years old. The general died that year, leaving his brother the sole patriarch. But Seward did not feel triumph. He felt fatigue. His marriage to Esther had long turned into a formality. The children had grown up and were awaiting the inheritance, leading their own convoluted lives full of scandals and drugs, typical problems of the golden youth of that era. Seward was fabulously rich, but absolutely lonely. He was a king without a kingdom, a man who had everything except a reason to wake up in the morning. His fortune consisted of Johnson & Johnson shares, which grew every year. The world was changing. The era of sexual revolution, rock and roll, and new values was dawning. And Seward was stuck in the past, in his tweed jackets and aristocratic manners. He was the perfect victim. He did not need another yacht. He did not need another impressionist painting. He needed what money cannot buy, but for which rich old men often pay the highest price. He needed admiration. He needed to feel alive. The system was unstable. The vacuum in the billionaire's soul had reached critical mass. And it was at this very moment, in May 1968, that a new employee appeared in his house, a woman who did not know who the general was, a woman who did not care about the social conventions of the American elite, a woman who came to wash floors but was preparing to seize the throne. The story was approaching its first turning point. The old world of Johnson & Johnson, the world of conservative men in gray suits, was about to collide with a hurricane from Eastern Europe. 1968. In that very year, when America was burning in protests against the Vietnam War and students were tearing up cobblestones on the streets of Paris, a woman entered the quiet, conservative Johnson mansion in New Jersey who brought a revolution personally to Seward. Her name was Barbara Piasecka. The family called her Basia. She was 31 years old. She had just flown in from socialist Poland. In her suitcase were a few dresses, a master's degree in art history from the University of Wrocław, and exactly $100. She did not speak English. She did not know the rules of the game in American high society. But she had what the Johnson clan catastrophically lacked: life, energy, and absolute fearlessness. The irony of fate was that Esther Johnson, Seward's wife, hired her for the job. Esther was looking for a cook. Basia could not even fry an egg, but she needed work. She agreed. Thus, the future owner of a half-billion fortune ended up in the kitchen washing dishes for people who did not even look her in the eyes. But this did not last long. J. Seward Johnson I, who was already 73 years old at that time, was dying of boredom in his own home. He was surrounded by people who were waiting for his death. His children saw him as an ATM. His wife saw him as social status. And suddenly, he notices the new maid. Basia was different. She was educated. She knew art better than all of Seward's rich friends combined. She could distinguish early Renaissance from Baroque. She was hot-tempered, emotional, and straightforward. For Seward, accustomed to hypocritical smiles and cold handshakes, she became a breath of pure oxygen. A merger of two seemingly incompatible worlds occurred. On one side, an aging patriarch, a symbol of American capitalism, tired of the burden of his name. On the other, a young, ambitious Polish intellectual who had escaped the grayness of the communist bloc and thirsted for beauty. They began to talk, first with gestures, then in broken English. Seward discovered that this maid understood his soul better than the woman he had lived with for 30 years. She listened to his stories about the ocean. She did not ask for money. She admired him as a man, not as Mr. Johnson. In 1971, Seward shocked the East Coast elite. He filed for divorce from Esther. He threw his wife out of the house, paying her a settlement, and 8 days after the divorce, married his former maid. The wedding took place in November 1971. The groom was 76 years old. The bride was 34. None of Seward's 4 children came to the ceremony. For them, it was not just an insult, it was a threat. The Polish fortune hunter, as they called her, had penetrated the Holy of Holies. But for Seward, it was the beginning of a second youth. Basia became his guide to the world he had always dreamed of, but feared to enter. The world of high art and mad luxury. She convinced him that he was not just the heir to a bandage manufacturer. She told him that he was a Medici of the 20th century, and he believed her. However, society closed its doors to them. Elite clubs in Princeton and New York, ruled by old money, refused to accept the new Mrs. Johnson. They considered her a vulgar upstart. They laughed at her accent. They whispered behind their backs. And then Basia made a strategic decision. If the world does not accept them, they will build their own world, one that will make all others fade in comparison. They decided to build a house. But it was not to be just a house. It was to be a manifesto, a declaration of independence from the family, from society, from boring American moderation. They chose a plot in Princeton, New Jersey, 140 acres of land. The irony was that to build their palace, Seward demolished the old mansion that was already on the site. It was a symbolic act, destruction of the past for the sake of the future. The project was named Yasna Polana, a direct reference to Leo Tolstoy's estate in Russia. Basia wanted to emphasize the intellectual and spiritual connection with great culture, renouncing American consumerism. To realize the plan, they hired architect Wallace Harrison, the very man who designed the Metropolitan Opera and the UN headquarters. This was a choice not for building a cozy nest. This was a choice for building a monument. Seward gave Basia carte blanche and a blank checkbook. Construction began, which lasted several years and cost $30 million. In today's terms, accounting for inflation and the cost of unique materials, hundreds of millions. This was the moment when Basia Piaseca Johnson began her transformation from a millionaire's wife into the chief curator of his life. She personally approved every stone. She rejected marble samples if they were not white enough. She fired contractors if they did not understand her vision. She was creating the stage on which the final part of her husband's life would play out. This house became the physical embodiment of their union, Seward's money and Basia's taste, American capital and European aesthetics. But in this foundation, the first crack was laid. The higher the walls of Jasna Polana rose, the thicker the wall between Seward and his children became. Mary Leah, Elaine, Diana, and Junior, Seward Jr., watched in horror as the inheritance they considered theirs by right of birth turned into granite, gilding, and paintings by old masters. Every million spent on construction was a million that would not go to them. Basia was not just spending money. She was changing the very structure of Seward's assets. Under her influence, he began selling Johnson & Johnson shares, what the general forbade under threat of curse, to buy art. She told Seward, "Stocks are paper, art is eternity." And they began buying eternity wholesale, Raphael, Botticelli, Rembrandt, furniture of Louis XIV, tapestries that hung in the royal palaces of Europe. Jasna Polana was to become the setting for this collection. Seward, who had felt like the stupid brother all his life, now owned a collection that museums envied. He finally felt significant. He looked at Basia with adoration. She gave him what neither his father nor his brother nor his first wife could, a sense of superiority. But this greatness came at a terrible price. Old Seward found himself in complete isolation. His circle of communication narrowed to architects, art dealers, and Basia herself. The children tried to call, but often could not get through the secretaries. Jasna Polana was not yet completed, but it was already casting a long shadow. Local residents looked with bewilderment at the rising walls resembling a fortress wall. They did not know that inside, not just a house was being created, but a golden cage from which there is no escape. By the time the main works were completed at the end of the 1970s, Seward was already over 80. He was ill. He was diagnosed with cancer. But Basia was full of energy. She was preparing to present her masterpiece to the world. She did not know that this house would become the place where one of the most brutal family conflicts of the century would unfold. She was building paradise, but laid the foundation for hell. To understand the scale of the tragedy that would unfold within the walls of this house, one must first understand the house itself. Jasna Polana in Princeton is not just a building. It is a psychological imprint of the souls of its creators, frozen in stone, marble, and gold. It is the architectural embodiment of the conflict between the mortal body of an 80-year-old man and the immortal ambitions of his young wife. When you approach the gates of the estate on Roosevelt Road, the first thing that catches the eye is aggressive isolation. 140 acres of land fenced as if there is a military facility inside, not a private residence. It is a state within a state. The main house, designed by Wallace Harrison, has an area of 46,000 square feet. Try to imagine this scale. It is larger than many city hospitals. It is the size of a small shopping mall given over to two people. The building's facade is executed in the neoclassical style, but with the coldness of modernism. It is a U-shaped structure framing an inner courtyard paved with cobblestones, each stone hand-picked. The walls are clad in limestone brought from the same quarries as the stone for Europe's cathedrals. When you enter through the massive oak doors, you are greeted not by coziness, but by the deafening silence of a museum. The first room is the Grand Hall, ceilings 2 stories high, floor of polished marble in which the light from crystal chandeliers reflects. There is no smell of home here, the smell of food, tobacco, or old books. Here it smells of museum wax and cold stone. The walls of this house were designed not for people, but for paintings. Basia Piaseca turned Jasna Polana into a repository for one of the most expensive private art collections in the world. Imagine that you are walking down the corridor. To your left hangs a canvas by Fra Angelico, and to your right, a drawing by Raphael. You pass by Botticelli sketches that are worth more than all the houses in the area combined. The furniture is not just chairs and tables. These are signed suites of French kings bought at Sotheby's and Christie's auctions for record sums. Seward Johnson sat in chairs in which monarchs sat. But did he feel like a king? The psychology of the space here screams of domination. Basia created an interior that demands submission. Servants in this house wore special liveries. Guests, even the highest-ranking ones, felt small and insignificant against the background of giant tapestries and monumental fireplaces in which an entire tree could be burned whole. But the most interesting is hidden in the functional details that reveal the true fears of the owner. In the house, a bathroom was designed and built that entered into legends. It cost millions of dollars, faucets of pure gold, marble of the rarest breeds. But the main thing, this was not just luxury, it was a hygienic obsession. The son of the founder of the company that gave the world sterility wanted to bathe in a sterile temple. Passing deeper into the house, we enter the indoor pool. This is a huge room with a glass dome reminiscent of a 19th century orangery. The water here was always maintained at the ideal temperature. Live tropical trees grew around the pool. This was an artificial paradise created to ignore New Jersey winters, ignore time, ignore reality. However, behind this facade of grandeur hid a frightening emptiness. The house had 36 rooms, but no one lived in them. Seward's children, those very 4 heirs, almost never crossed the threshold of this palace. And if they did come, they felt like strangers. It is known that visitors were made to wear special shoe covers or soft slippers to not scratch the precious parquet and marble. Imagine this scene. Adult people, millionaires, heirs of the empire, tiptoeing through their father's house in felt slippers, afraid to breathe on the masterpieces that their stepmother bought. This was a house where things were more important than people. Art here was valued above family ties. But the most sinister room in Jasna Polana was neither the gallery nor the golden bathroom. It was a room whose existence few knew about. The medical block. Seward Johnson was aging. Cancer was slowly devouring his body. Basia, understanding this, equipped the house with the most modern medical ward available at the time. It was a luxury-class ICU, ventilators, vital signs monitors, oxygen supply, defibrillators. She built a hospital inside the palace. Psychologically, This room symbolized Seward's main fear, death. He spent $30 million on building paradise on Earth. But in the center of this paradise stood a hospital bed. This house was a golden cage with climate control. Seward Johnson found himself locked in his own grandeur. The windows of Jasna Polana overlooked perfectly manicured lawns and an artificial lake where swans swam. But he looked at this landscape through bulletproof glass. The architecture of Jasna Polana worked as a dividing mechanism. It cut Seward off from the past, from his family, and from the outside world. Basia became the sole gatekeeper. She controlled who enters and who leaves. Architect Wallace Harrison created the walls, and Basia filled them with rules. The house library held thousands of volumes, but did anyone read them? The dining room had a table for 20 people, but how often was laughter heard at it? Jasna Polana became a monument to loneliness. Every interior detail, from the door handle to the ceiling fresco, said one thing: look how rich we are. But if you listened closely, these walls whispered something else. Look how scared we are. By the early 1980s, construction was completed. The house stood in all its frightening splendor. Seward Johnson, who was over 85, moved through these endless corridors more and more slowly. His body was weakening, his mind was clouding, and around him on the walls hung eternal saints and Madonnas by old masters, looking at the dying old man with the indifference of eternity. 1983. Spring in Princeton was particularly cold, but inside Jasna Polana the temperature reached the boiling point. Seward Johnson was 87 years old. The patriarch who had survived the Jazz era, the Great Depression, and World War II was now fighting his last battle. And his enemy was not a business competitor, but his own prostate gland. Cancer had metastasized. His body, once commanding yachts in the open ocean, had turned into a fragile shell chained to a medical bed. It was right here, in the sterile silence of the master bedroom, that the drama unfolded which poses the most complex moral question before us. Who is Barbara Piasecka Johnson, a devoted caregiver who held her dying husband's hand when everyone else turned away, or a cold-blooded manipulator who isolated the victim to extract the final signature? The facts speak as follows. In the last months of Seward Johnson's life, Jasna Polana turned into a fortress. Basia fired the old guards. She replaced the staff. Telephone lines were monitored. Access to Mr. Johnson became practically impossible, even for his closest friends. But the most terrible thing happened at the relations with the children. Mary Leah, Elaine, Diana, and Junior tried to see their father, but every time they ran into a wall. They were told that the father was sleeping, that he was too weak, that he did not want to see anyone. Imagine the humiliation. The heirs of one of America's richest families were forced to make an appointment to see their own dying father through the stepmother's secretary. And even when they were let in, the visits lasted minutes, and Basia was always present in the room, like a warden. The children claimed that their father looked drugged, disoriented, and frightened. They saw a plea for help in his eyes. However, there is another side to the coin. Witnesses, doctors, and nurses would later tell that it was Basia, not the children, who changed the old man's diapers. It was she who fed him from a spoon. It was she who endured his outbursts of anger and senile dementia. Seward's children, raised with silver spoons in their mouths, were squeamish about the physiology of dying. Basia, the former maid, was not afraid of dirt. Here lies the moral ambivalence of this story. Does the one who wipes the drool from the dying deserve billions while the rightful heirs wait for the end in their limousines? But was it love or calculation? The answer lies in the documents. April 14th, 1983, 39 days before Seward's death. In the bedroom, an event occurs that will become the epicenter of the future legal explosion. Attorney Nina Zagat enters the room. This is not the old family lawyer of the Johnsons who handled affairs for decades. This is a lawyer loyal to Basia. A new document is brought to Seward for signature. This was not the first change to the will. During the years of marriage to Basia, Seward changed his last will dozens of times, but this time was fatal. In this document, Seward Johnson practically completely struck his children from the inheritance. He also deprived funding for his favorite oceanographic institute, Harbor Branch, which was the work of his entire life. The entire estate, stocks, real estate, art collection, cash, passed to Barbara Piaseca Johnson. The amount was estimated at $400, according to some sources, $500 million. Did he sign this in his right mind, or was his hand guided by fear of being left alone in the face of death? At that moment, Seward was weak. He could barely hold the pen. The ink on the paper recorded not just the transfer of assets, but the final severing of generational ties. Basia won. She got everything. But this victory had the taste of ashes. On May 23, 1983, J. Seward Johnson I died. Death occurred in that very room that Basia furnished with such luxury. The great recluse departed. His body was carried out of the house he built, but in which he never truly managed to live. The funeral was surreal. The entire elite gathered in the church. The children stood by the coffin with stone faces. The widow, dressed in black, looked not broken by grief, but majestic. Conflict hung in the air thick as fog. No one cried. Everyone awaited the reading of the will, and when that moment arrived, it thundered like a gunshot. The children knew Basia would get much. They expected her to take the house and paintings, but they did not expect total annihilation. The will stated, "Everything goes to Basia." The children nothing except what was already in their trusts, which, to be fair, were also substantial. But that was old wealth, not the father's inheritance. For the children, this was not just a matter of money. It was a slap in the face. The father publicly, legally declared that his young wife was more important to him than his blood descendants. It was rejection on a biological level. Junior, Mary Leah, and the others perceived it as a declaration of war. Their lawyers, the prestigious firm Sullivan and Cromwell, began preparing the lawsuit. Their argument was simple and terrifying. Barbara Piaseca Johnson is not a loving wife. She is a predator who exploited the old man's physical weakness and mental instability to rob the family. They accused her of abuse, intimidation, and fraud. Newspaper headlines exploded, "The Johnson Case, Maid versus Dynasty." The public held its breath in anticipation. Seward Johnson wanted peace. He wanted to be remembered as a patron and art connoisseur. Instead, his death launched a mechanism that would drag the family's dirtiest secrets into the light. His body was not yet cold, and the lawyers were already sharpening their knives. For Basia, this was the moment of truth. She thought that with her husband's death, she would gain freedom and the status of the full-fledged queen of Yasna Polana. But she was wrong. Seward's death became the beginning of her siege. 1986. New York, Lower Manhattan, the Surrogates Court building on Chambers Street. Here, in stuffy room number 503, the final battle for the Johnson Empire began. This was the trial that the press dubbed the most expensive and scandalous inheritance dispute in the history of the United States. On one side of the courtroom sat Seward's 4 children, heirs to old money, with their army of lawyers from Sullivan and Cromwell. On the other side, Barbara Piasecka Johnson, the Polish Cinderella, defended by the elite firm Milbank Tweed. For 17 weeks, the jury listened to the story of the moral decay of a great dynasty. The crisis that engulfed the family was absolute. If before, conflicts were hidden behind the high walls of Jasna Polana, now they were broadcast to the entire country. The children's lawyers painted Basia as a monster. They called witnesses who claimed she yelled at Seward, called him a stupid old man, threatened him, and isolated him from the world. They described Jasna Polana not as a home, but as a torture chamber upholstered in silk. Basia's defense struck back. They portrayed the children as greedy vultures who ignored their father for years and remembered him only when it was time to divide the money. Basia appeared as the only woman who cared for Seward as he died of cancer and suffered from incontinence. Legal costs reached an astronomical sum, $24 million. Only the lawyers emerged from this courtroom as unequivocal winners. But the most dramatic moment was not the testimony, but the deal. June 1986. The jury retired for deliberations. Tension in the courthouse corridors was unbearable. Both sides understood the verdict could be anything. It was Russian roulette. If the jury deemed Seward incompetent, Basia would lose everything. If competent, the children would be left with nothing. The fear of loss proved stronger than hatred. While the jury argued behind closed doors, the lawyers struck a deal. The terms of the settlement stunned Wall Street. Barbara Piasecka Johnson retained the lion's share of the estate, more than $300 million plus Jasna Polana and the art collection. The children received about $40 million among the 4 before taxes, which was a drop in the ocean compared to their father's fortune. But it saved face. The Harbor Branch Institute received $20 million. It seemed Basia had won. She emerged from the court as Poland's richest woman and one of America's wealthiest widows. But this victory led to an unexpected transformation. Returning to the empty Jasna Polana, she realized the terrible irony of her situation. She had won a house in which it was impossible to live. Maintaining Jasna Polana cost millions of dollars a year. Property taxes, security, heating of huge halls, climate control for the paintings. All this turned into a financial black hole. The house built as a monument to love became a monument to extravagance. It was too large for one person, too cold, too steeped in memories of trials and illness. And here occurs the turning point in the heroine's psychology, transformation of values. Basia, who 10 years earlier bought art to prove her greatness, began getting rid of things. In 1990, she put furniture and decor items up for auction. Chairs, tables, carpets, everything that made up the soul of the house went under the hammer for millions. But what to do with the house itself? Demolish it? Sell it to another billionaire? The decision Basia made was pragmatic and symbolic at the same time. She decided to open the gates. She turned the closed fortress into a public space, albeit an elite one. Jasna Polana became a golf club. In the mid-1990s, she struck a deal with the PGA Tour organization. Great golfer Gary Player designed the course on those very lawns where lonely Seward walked. The mansion where Raphael and Botticelli hung turned into a clubhouse. In those halls where the patriarch died, rich golfers now dine. Guest rooms were turned into locker rooms and offices. This was transcendence through commercialization. Basia realized that holding on to greatness alone was impossible. The only way to preserve the house was to give it to people, even if for a membership fee. Basia herself left America. She moved to Monaco, returning to Europe from where she came 30 years ago as a poor student. Her attitude toward wealth also changed. If in the 1970s she accumulated, in the 2000s she began giving away. She immersed herself in philanthropy, especially helping children with autism. In 2004, she committed an act that finally closed the gestalt of her ambitions. She sold the pearl of her collection, the badminton cabinet, the most expensive 18th century bureau in the world. She sold it to the Prince of Liechtenstein for $36 million. Money was no longer the goal. It became a tool. Was Basia seeking redemption, or had she simply grown tired of the burden of ownership? The crisis of 1986 broke the family, but it freed Basia from the illusion that happiness could be built from marble. Jasna Polana ceased to be the Johnsons' house. It became just a beautiful building with a good restaurant. But the dynasty's curse did not disappear with the sale of the furniture. It simply bided its time to strike at the weakest link. While Basia was saving her soul in Europe, a new generation of Johnsons was growing up in America, including Casey Johnson, the daughter of Seward Jr., a girl who was born with a silver spoon in her mouth, but without love in her heart. The money for which they fought so fiercely in 1986 flowed to the grandchildren, and this stream turned out to be poisonous. The story came full circle and returned to where we began, to loneliness in a rich house. January 4th, 2010. We returned to the point where we started, to the cold bungalow in Los Angeles where Casey Johnson's body was found. Now, knowing the story of Jasna Polana, the story of betrayal, trials, and $30 million spent on marble, we look at this death completely differently. This is not just an accident. This is a direct consequence of that very battle that ended in 1986. The money that killed Casey came from that very trust for which her father, Seward Jr., fought. If the Johnson family had spent even a tenth of the energy that went into lawsuits on raising and emotionally supporting their children, this girl would be alive. The symbolism here reaches its peak. Casey Johnson died of diabetes. The Johnson & Johnson Corporation is the world leader in the production of glucometers and insulin pumps. She had access to the best doctors on the planet. But she lacked the main thing, a reason to live, and people who would notice that she had stopped answering calls. Her death places the final seal on the history of the dynasty. As a family, the corporation thrives, stocks rise, but the human line of the lineage turned out to be broken under the weight of its own gold. And what happened to the main heroine of our drama, the woman who built Jasna Polana? Barbara Piasecka Johnson, the legendary Basia, outlived her husband by exactly 30 years. She died on April 1st, 2013. She was 76 years old. It was symbolic that she did not die in America or Monaco. She returned to die in Poland, in Wrocław, the city of her youth. The circle closed. The girl with $100 in her pocket, who became one of the richest women in the world, finally understood that native soil is more important than marble palaces. Her legacy turned out to be as contradictory as she was. She bequeathed the bulk of her fortune not to relatives, but to a charitable foundation. She built schools, helped children with autism, supported art. In Poland, she is considered a national heroine and patron. In America, she is remembered as the maid who stole an old man's heart and wallet. But the main monument to the story stands in Princeton, New Jersey. Today, if you drive to the address 4821 Roosevelt Road, you will not see the closed gates of a private residence. You will see the sign, TPC Jasna Polana. The former home of Seward and Bazia is now one of the most prestigious private golf clubs in the United States. This is the final irony of fate. The house built as a sanctuary of art and seclusion turned into a commercial enterprise, where Raphael's canvases hung, tournament boards now hang. In the dining room, where the fates of hundreds of millions of dollars were decided, club sandwiches and Diet Coke are now served to tired bankers after a game. The grand staircase down which Seward Johnson descended in the last days of his life now serves as a backdrop for wedding photo shoots of strangers. The walls meant to preserve eternity now preserve only the echo of golf strikes on the ball. We see three levels of tragedy here. The first level is architectural, the attempt to replace human warmth with square footage. Seward Johnson thought that if he built a house worthy of a king, he would become a king. But he remained just a frightened man in rooms that were too large. The second level is familial, the conflict between old money and new energy. Seward's children believed that the money belonged to them by right of birth. Basia believed that money belongs to those who care for it. Everyone lost in this war. The children got the money, but lost their father, and ultimately themselves, as Casey's fate showed. The third level is philosophical. This is a story about the fact that legacy cannot be bought. Robert Wood Johnson I left behind a company that saves lives. His grandson Seward left behind the most expensive court case in history and a house that became a golf course. In a world where we constantly strive for accumulation, the Johnson story serves as a cold shower. It reminds us that success, the amount of money in the account, and legacy, what remains in people's hearts, are completely different currencies. The Johnson dynasty created products that heal wounds on the skin, but they failed to create anything that would heal the wounds inside their own family. Today, when you take a jar of baby powder or a pack of Band-Aids with the red Johnson & Johnson logo in your hands, remember this story. Remember the empty pool in Hollywood. Remember the old man dying in a room that cost $30 million. Remember the woman who won everything but died far from the house she built. True value is not what we own. It is who holds our hand in the last minute. Seward Johnson had Basia's hand, but that hand cost him his relationship with his children. Casey Johnson had no one's hand. Jasna Polana still stands, shining with its limestone in the New Jersey sun, beautiful, majestic, and absolutely indifferent to those who created it. Stone does not know how to love. That is the privilege of the living, and it is the only wealth that cannot be litigated in court.